What's up everyone, my name is Rosendo, welcome back to my channel. We are back with another track breakdown. Today we are looking at Call, the last track out of my discography that's currently out as of November 16th, I want to say. November 16th, 2024. So after this, hopefully I'm going to be looking at a few other video ideas, although I do have more music coming on the way, something pretty big coming on the way in the next, actually next month, almost 30 days from now. But today we're looking at Call. It's a very important track. This was my fall, about fall 2020. It was late summer, but closer to fall. Fall 2024 release, drum and bass track that we're going to take into, we're going to break down. There's a lot of cool things I want to share about this track that I'll probably just get straight into. So without further ado, let's hop into FL Studio. Make sure to like and subscribe, and let's do this. All right, we are back into FL Studio, taking a look at the project file for Call. It's actually labeled Call on the top. I must have actually put in the info. This is something I forget to do. I actually need to do this. Let's take a real quick look while we're here. 21 hours and 4 minutes. I like that. It's not too short. It's not too long. Not that there is such a thing as too short in a way, because, I mean, you got a track done faster and it's good quality. That's probably a good thing. But here we are looking at about 70 mixer tracks, which is very, very high. Now, part of the reason, of course, listen to the track if you haven't already. Part of the reason that is because this track has two very unique sections. So one section is going to have X amount of mixer tracks, and for a whole new section, I needed a whole new set of instruments and synths and sounds like that. But either way, it's still pushing on the higher end. Even right now, I think I'm starting a brand new track, not brand new, but a new track idea. First one that I've started in a long time that I'm not even close to being done. And I think I've already stuck 30 mixer tracks in there, versus back in the day, my ideas would be close to finish and I would call it 30 mixer tracks. I remember sometimes having about 20 mixer tracks and thinking, hey, this is pretty close to being done. Now I'm probably at 25 or something, probably closing in on 30 at this point. And I'm still very much just getting the kind of the foundation in. But that's beside the point, because we are looking at Call, my drum and bass track, 171 BPM up at the top. I believe Express should have been 172, but more or less the same area, same BPM. Quite a few things to look at: drums, synths, leads, passing tones, we call them. Basses, more bass stuff, bass effects a little bit, pretty much all over here, and a ton of effects over here, patterns on the left, quite a bit of stuff. Pretty organized track, which is good, because I think, as I mentioned, as I got better at producing, things got less organized because I was more kind of in the zone and just throwing stuff on there. This looks nice and organized. Again, somewhat of a simple track, but there's a few really important things, two very important things, two and a half kind of, that I want to share about this track. So without further ado, let's talk about why I made this track. All right, now Call is an interesting track because if you see my track breakdown videos, or if you've listened to my discography, or if you've been following along with some of my kind of production characteristics, you know that I'm a fan of three: expression, progression, and intention. I've mentioned in the past that expression and intention are kind of the weird ones, because a lot of times expression is the intention, so they're kind of more like a two-in-one. I think even in one of my, I can't remember if it was which breakdown video it was, I mentioned that I kind of take back the expression because expression is a form of intention. But I want to separate the two again, because expression is the form of intention, but the intention isn't always expression. That's kind of what I realized actually as I started working on more music. Expression is such a big important characteristic for me, and that most of the times that's the intention. But it's not just about having intention and why you make the tracks, but it's about making decisions with intention in your tracks. So those are two distinct characteristics that I wanted to separate, which brings me to this track. One of the reasons this track is so interesting, actually one of the reasons this track isn't interesting as well, is because there's actually no expression going on here. And this is probably, the first two tracks of my discography. Again, I've defined my discography in these breakdown videos a million times already. I think 3. The first two tracks of my discography, which were the Fake ID Tech House remix and Low, those tracks didn't really have any expression, and they weren't meant to have expression. They were house tracks. And then we got to Exposition, Express, Progress, Release, and now we're on Call. But after Exposition, pretty much all my tracks had some form of expression, and now we're back to the point where this track actually doesn't have any expression. Now, there's still going to be intention to it in the decisions I made, but this track is actually one of the ones that doesn't have expression, so there's actually not a lot I'm going to be rambling on about here. That's the good news for you viewers who probably don't like to watch 40, 50, 60-minute videos, or maybe you do. I would, if you're really trying to learn something about someone else's producing style and characteristics, maybe even learn a few producing tricks along the way, which actually we will be doing in here, because again, since there's not a lot of expression, we're going to be talking a little bit about more of the ins and outs and the technical aspects, which I'm going to mention a little bit more later. So the technical aspects of this track. But as far as expression goes, I'm getting carried away, which I tend to do. So why did I make this track? I didn't make this track for any specific intention in a way. There's intention behind it, which I'll get to. But there's no expression here, right? There's no really emotion being portrayed. I'll tell you a little bit about why I actually made the track in a second. But again, this is an interesting track because it's not interesting. No expression, nothing like, Progress, where you're trying to really, let's take exposition, where you're trying to define a sound. Expression, where you're trying to have fun with, how you portray genres. Progress, where you're trying to really set an example of what progression is and kind of capturing that progressive house feeling. Release, where you're trying to capture an emotion and a vibe, really get that kind of euphoric feeling to it. Now we are at Progress. So that aside, why did I make this track? I made this track for two reasons. Number one, I was kind of, just making tracks, getting an idea of the tracks I wanted to make, and two things happened. The first one is that, if you saw the last track breakdown, if you saw release track breakdown, I mentioned that in release I started to mess around with Splice, and I finally started to scroll through Splice, have some fun, get some samples for my track ideas. And if you follow me on TikTok or on YouTube, I made a video that actually captures how this track was made perfectly, which was first, before I mentioned that, if you saw the low track breakdown, and low, I mentioned I have a hard time starting track ideas, and I don't really have a hard time starting a track from scratch without some sort of inspiration, a chord progression, a melody, a sample, or something. So if you saw that short form video, let me tell you exactly what happened when I made this track. I was scrolling through Splice looking for samples for house tracks, because that's what everyone does, right? We all go through Splice, we try to make a house track, and we think we need some vocals for this, we need something catchy, something groovy. And I spend quite a bit of time over the course of several days, maybe even several weeks, just kind of going through Splice, going through 125, 126, 127 BPM samples, and trying to find something to make a house track. And I think, this is pointless, because I couldn't find anything. Changed the BPM to 172. I said, Splice actually might even have some good drum and bass samples. I thought of that. I thought, what if I search for some vocal samples, at 172, try to see if I can make a drum and bass track. And that's how I found this one right here, which I'm going to break down in a second. But that's why I made this track. Number one, scrolling through Splice, gave up on the house BPM, went to drum and bass, found it, liked it, already heard the track in my head. And number two, around that time, I discovered two new drum and bass songs that were really synth heavy. I always listen to drum and bass, and all these tracks have their own unique characteristics. Some are more groovy, some are liquid, some have that kind of dance floor energy. Some are very synth heavy, and I'm a pretty big synth heavy person. I like tracks with a lot of synths and supersaws. So around that time, I wanted to make a new, because even something like Express was kind of strange, because it was more about kind of the feeling and not really just the sound there. I don't know exactly how to put it into words, but Express didn't really portray other parts of drum and bass that I really liked, like certain synth heavy drum and bass tracks. Which is why when I heard this vocal sample, and around that time I was listening to some synth heavy drum and bass tracks, I wanted to make one. So I heard the vocal sample, started to picture the track in my head, wanted to make a synth heavy drum and bass track, and that's why I made this track. Now, as far as why I named it Call, we will probably talk about that when we start breaking down the vocal sample. Other than that, there's not much I need to really break down. I need to see, again, there's one more important characteristic that will be important probably over here. Actually, not even over here. It's going to be important over here. So that's going to be the other exciting one. So why don't we just get into the breakdown while we're at it. All right. So again, 171 BPM, starting with the ride on every other beat. I really like doing this because, as I mentioned what tracks haven't I mentioned this in? Not Progress. Progress actually does the exact opposite of what I'm about to mention. Express is my other drum and bass track, and it did it perfectly. Release kind of does the same thing, where at the beginning of the track, you have some semblance of a rhythm going, but it's not enough to really define where you're going to be, kind of at what BPM you are. If you have an ear for these things and you pick it up, at what BPM you're in, but it doesn't really give you enough of the rhythm to know what the track's going to feel like and progress like until later in the track. So Express probably started with the same thing. Rides on every other beat, so it kind of slows the tempo down a little bit, so you don't really get that fast tempo until over here allows you to progress the track really nicely. So again, it's just about slowing it down a little bit. That's the other thing I really like about the release intro, is that there's no drums. It's just that bass and that vocal pad that take up a lot of the space, and then when the drum kicks in, you really get that 90 BPM feel going. And that's something I did in a lot of my tracks that I didn't do in Progress, which is why I really like the Progress intro, because it just gets that 128 right in your face as soon as the track starts. And it really just kind of gets that rhythm going. And then you play around with the rhythm and Progress to establish progression, which I really like. So we're doing the same thing here. We're starting with a ride on every other beat and this really nice synth that I like that kind of has the LFO automation to it. That just really establishes a nice feel. A little bit of a rhythm, a little bit of a kind of some width to it. Is this what this is? Okay. I actually thought this was a different preset. Cool. But yeah, this sounds pretty cool. Again, levels being oscillated. Actually just one synth. I thought it was more than one. And then the panning. What's this? Filter cutoff. Yeah, moving up and down. Not much going on. It sounds like there's a lot of width to it, but I guess I'm just probably thinking of phaser and dimension and yeah, all that stuff. In any case, let's take a look at this rhythm because I really like this. So levels going up and down. Let's get the ride back in here. Levels going up and down, getting a little bit of filter, getting automation, getting this strange feeling that you don't get in Express as well. Because in Express, you kind of start pretty quickly with that feel of that euphoric kind of angelic energy again. Here, it's a little bit more mysterious, and the mystery works really well when we get to over here in a second. But again, it's a little bit more mysterious. You just have some chords. They're moving. You don't quite know where they're going to move. The rhythm is a little bit slow with a ride on every other beat. And then we throw in a little bit of movement. If you pay attention to the track, you can hear this automation right here that I really like. It's very subtle, but it switches things up enough. A little bit of noise over here. And a vocal sample. So this is one of the things I really like about this intro, because I mentioned last time that in Release was my first time using Splice. And this is the first track. Release had a vocal chop in it. And this is the first track I released using vocals. Of course, it's a Splice sample, so it's not like I made this or I worked with a vocalist. But at the end of the day, it is still the first track I made using a vocal sample. Now that you've heard part of it, why don't we listen to the whole thing? Because this is originally what it sounded like. This is what I found going through Splice when I ditched house, went to drum and bass, and found a sample that sounded like this. And the delay is on. Let's get the dry signal. So call my name in the dark. Doesn't really matter where you are. If you're near or you're far, I just want to feel you in my heart. That is what the track started with. So one of the things I really like about this intro is it kind of masks the rhythm a little bit. You get that every other beat ride. So the 171 is there. Obviously, if you listen to it, you can hear that 171. But the rhythm isn't quite as prominent because it's kind of masked by the ride on every other beat. And as I mentioned, because the intro is a little bit mysterious, you don't really know where it's going to go. It introduces a little bit of movement over here. If you don't know what to expect, then the vocals kind of come as a surprise, because again, I like to imagine people are listening to my discography, not necessarily in order, but if you're following along and you're getting each release as you get it, it kind of catches you by surprise that all of a sudden you're listening to a track made by me, a Rosendo track, and then for the first time ever, you get some vocals, which I think is really cool. Now, real quick, I think it's worth mentioning that for all my tracks, I release I call them teasers. I release teasers on my Instagram. If you don't follow me on Instagram, you can follow me on Instagram. That's linked in the description. But I release teasers for all my tracks. One of the things I don't like to do is I don't really like to release kind of, actual parts of the track. For example, the drop. I don't like to, share the drop before the track comes out. Because if you've listened to any of my other tracks and you've hopefully kind of picked up on the way I view music and view music as an art, then you kind of know that I like to really view music as art and appreciate it for what it is. And almost exactly like a movie, if I feel like if I share the drop of a song before it comes out, it's like I'm spoiling the song for my audience, and that's the last thing I want to do. So that's why I don't really like to share parts of my songs, and that's why I really like this intro, And B, the teaser I share for my tracks are usually very subtle. They'll contain either the intro of the track or something kind of, for example, Progress was a really cool teaser if you ask me. That one's a little bit complicated. Express was the intro. Exposition was the intro. Release was also a little bit different, but that was a fun one as well. For Call, I also released just the intro, just this part right here. And the teaser works so well because, again, if you're listening to my discography and you see that on my Instagram and you think, hey, he's releasing a new song, I wonder what the song sounds like. Let's listen to the teaser. And you get this rhythm and you kind of hear it building up a little bit. And then all of a sudden you hear the vocals. It's very intriguing because you realize that for the first time I'm releasing something with vocals. Now, of course, that kind of spoils it, but because I'm just releasing this first part, I think it still presents itself really, really well. Especially since I'm not releasing something over here, because then you already know where the track's going to go, and then it doesn't get as interesting because you already know what the drop's going to sound like, i.e. the track is spoiled. So as far as this part goes, I really like it because if you're listening to my discography, if you're watching that teaser for the first time, it's kind of the first moment that you realize, oh, wow, this has vocals in it. Again, just a splice sample, not that big of a deal, but it's a big stepping stone. All right, so enough about that. Moving on. Now, we're going to talk about this a little bit because over here, we have the vocal sample that I started with, and it would have been really easy just to bring this over here and have the track. Actually, I need to remember that this is the original project file, so I don't want to change it up because if you saw the progress breakdown, you'll remember that I forgot to clone the project file, and I'm already recording audio here, so I need to not change anything. But it would have been easy to bring the vocal over here and call it a day. And then just have that going on for the intro. But if you saw my progress breakdown video, you know that progression is not only one of my signature characteristics, but I think all tracks should have progression. So it kind of sounded, first of all, I already heard it in my head this way. So it's not like I experimented and got it. This is what the track idea sounded like in my head. But it's so meaningful and it just makes such a big difference that I could have easily just taken this vocal sample, brought it over here, and had the intro be the whole track. The whole vocal sample, and just establish it right away. But I just feel like establishing it right away just takes away from the vocal, the movement and the rhythm that I wanted to build in the drop, which I'll get to when I get to the drop. It takes away from that movement and rhythm that I wanted to build in. And it also just kind of, it makes it lack variation, because if you already hear what the vocal sounds like in its entirety, then it's just more of the same stuff over and over again. Especially, which I'm going to get into over here, especially when you can't do much with the vocal sample because they're not your own vocals. You don't record it. You can't add more phrases. You can't change around the rhythm too much. You can sample it and do some cool things with it, but it's not your original vocal, so you don't have the freedom to do whatever you want with it. And I think A, that's important, and B, that's why it makes so much sense to chop this up at the beginning, spread it apart a little bit more. To A, preserve a little bit of that rhythmic variation and that groove that we're going to establish over here, but B, to make sure the track doesn't get too stale when you're working with a vocal that you can't change and alter that much. Now, of course, to make up for all these gaps that we have right here, some delay is necessary. So this delay is really nice to fill in that gap. Let's take a listen to this verse in its entirety. Delay fills up the void. Get a really nice synth right there. Plus a bass taking up quite a bit of room, some crashes over here. And again, that vocal split up a little bit with the delay, taking up the space. Now, as far as the synth goes, why don't we just listen to each one on its own? As far as the synth goes, you have the intro chord right here that we already listened to, except this time it's with these passing tones the entire time. It adds a good amount of movement. And these verse chords that I really like out of Serum should be chords Victory, yep. And that give you that impact. I use this in a lot of my tracks. I think I used it in Release, I can't remember, but I use it in a lot of my tracks now after I discovered it. I really like the synth sound, but also it should have, some delay and reverb. It takes up some really nice sides, so the impact and the attack adds a really nice feel to the track, plus this bass, which sounds more like a mid bass, which I really like. This is actually one of the first basses I used quite a bit, because Spire was the first VST that I got. If you saw a Release breakdown, you'll remember I mentioned this. This was one of my favorite earliest presets, this bass sidechain. I really like this one. So everything contributes to the mood over here. Cutting up this vocal sample perfectly, getting that delay. And again, at this point, if you're listening to the track for the first time, you hear those vocal samples coming in, and you're getting a feel for what the track's gonna sound like. All right, so moving on into the build-up. First of all, we extend this delay. You'll notice that over here, we're taking the delay away before the next vocal comes in, which is what this automation does right here. But over here, right before the build-up, the delay stays there. So it stays into the next phrase right here. Delay is still there, and we get a lead, a really nice one. And that's the build up. The main difference is, oh, actually, let's take a look at this that sometimes I forget about. Look at that, side chain is off over here and gets turned on a little bit. Something that I do all the time. The intro chords get taken away. These go away, and we're left with the verse chords with that impact right here to really pair nicely with this snare buildup. And we introduce these passing tones, these leads. I'll mention a little bit more about them over here, but this lead over here also does a good job of introducing the lead, and just introducing a little bit more movement into that buildup. Pretty simple buildup. Add some noise, I'm assuming. Yep. Into the drop. Now, if you're listening and you have a good ear for music production, see if you notice anything different about this drop versus actually literally up to this point every other drop that I've made, all of them. See if you can hear anything different. It's going to be pretty hard to notice, and you probably won't even notice until I tell you, but this is the biggest difference. This is a huge difference between this track and the tracks I've made, while I just break down the drop a little bit, especially on the drums. All right, I hope there wasn't any clipping. There's some clipping coming out of my headphones, but there shouldn't be any clipping in this track. I wonder if you guys noticed that. Again, you probably didn't, and I'm going to tell you what it was anyways, but before we do that, let's just look at the drop breakdown a little bit, because we have all these drums, classic drum and bass pattern. Really nice. A little loop over here with a ride on every beat. Actually, this is a closed hi-hat, but the loop probably contains a ride. We get into the synths. Let's just do something like this. We get into the synths. We got the synths over here. Looks like what, 1, 2, 3, 4 supersaws. This last one is just mono, just to take up some space. I did mention we were going to get a little bit more into the production side of things. So why don't we take a listen to each one individually, starting with the verse chords. This impact that we already listened to, still there. Main one. Come on. Oh, there we go. This one right here. What do we have here? Serum presets. Probably one out of Splice that I really like. Nice supersaws over here. Secondary pad for the drop. Well, this one's actually a little bit more mono. I'm wondering why I had another mono layer. Although my guess is, yeah. Probably just... Yeah, there we go. Something sounded funny. It's actually not mono at all. It's completely to the sides. That kind of fooled me. A little bit extreme. And it's funny because this is the one track I do want to start talking about mixing decisions. I don't know why I did something as extreme as this. I was probably just trying to even out the width of the track, because we do have this one over here, this mono supersaw, that takes up a good amount of the center. So maybe in tandem with something like this, let's get all of them back together. That makes a little bit more sense. Plus this main one filling out a little bit of the center over here, plus the reverb. Then the width kind of makes sense. But hey, it's pretty noisy anyways, and a lot of times noise wants to be out to the side anyways. So I'm okay with this. Sounds good at the end of the day. Anyways, those are the synths. Let's take a look at these basses. Really gritty bass. Really nice, nicely mixed bass as well, which kind of goes into what I was going to mention earlier. main sidechain that we had earlier. Nice mid bass that hopefully takes up a little bit of the sides. Nice, not too much, but a little bit. And a sub. That was a really nice sub. Kickstart looks like it's not on it. I don't know why, but I'm assuming there's sidechain. Yep, so ducks anyways. There's a lot of kind of a sidechain going on, a little bit of pumping going on in the track. So the fact that the bass isn't sidechained, I'm okay with. Sorry, it is sidechained, but no kickstart. I'm okay with, because we're just here to get a little bit of groove. Yeah, the sub is present for most of the track. The rhythm comes from elsewhere. Anyways, that's beside the point. Because what is the biggest difference between this track and every other track I've made? The biggest difference is this. If you've seen my track breakdowns up to this point, you'll know that I've said the same phrase several times. Every time I'm looking at my mixing channels and I see something that looks like, I don't know, this. I would say something along the lines of a compressor, which I absolutely did not know how to use at the time. And the reason I can say that so confidently is because this is the first track where I actually knew how to use compression, and it made such a big difference. I mean, it's an unbelievable difference. Without a side-by-side comparison of what this drum area, even just the drums, but the whole track, what this drum area sounds like to any of my other tracks, the compression, without a side-by-side comparison, might not be as noticeable. But if you have them side by side, or if you just have an ear for these things, I mean, it's a night and day difference how much of a difference compression can make. And I want to talk a little bit about what changed between this track and my last track. Now, two things I need to mention are, if you saw my progress breakdown, you'll mention that I didn't really know how to use compression properly, but I knew enough of what it was that I was able to compress the bass guitar in the track, because the bass guitar was played by myself. So it was so dynamic that it was easy enough to know, hey, they're all 1/8 notes. I'll adjust the threshold, adjust ratios, all that stuff, just to make it more balanced. That was easy enough. But when you're looking at buses and synths and all this things, even just compressing a sample on its own that is, I don't know, like a hi-hat or kick, something like this, compressing something like this, compressing a snare that hits, every once in a while, a kick, a ride, and then you get buses on top of everything where everything's layered on top of each other. Compressing all that stuff didn't really make sense. How do you make sounds punchier, thicker, fatter, make them more balanced? Fast attack time, slow release, slow attack time, fast release, slow release. How do you know what to do all these things? That was a challenge. Now, I just need to go off the bat and say, I think most of the compression tutorials on YouTube are just horrible, because I knew about compression. I knew it was an important tool, and I had to watch tutorial after tutorial and explanation after explanation, and I'd gotten nowhere because I feel like none of them really explained why we did it. They would show you what a compressor does, but they never really explained why or how or when, what purpose, what to change, what to adjust, what changing something does, how it affects something, how a slow attack time, how a fast attack time, how a slow release time, fast release time would change a sample, when to use it, when not to use it, things like that. I feel like there's just so many bad compression tutorials out there that I never understood compression until I can't remember how I wanted to tackle the root of the issue. But at one point I thought, you know what, I probably should know how to use compression, because up to that point I hadn't. I was using a lot of OTT, and that's actually about it. I was using a lot of OTT. Fortunately, I never reached for Sound Goodizer, although that would have been a crutch, but it probably would have been better than no compression at all. I experimented with Camel Crusher, but because I didn't really know why it sounded so good, it was the same reason for Sound Goodizer. I knew Camel Crusher made my sound better, but it just made it sound thicker and fatter. And if I just made everything thick and fat, then my track would just be dead and lifeless. So I was always careful with Camel Crusher because I didn't really know how it worked from a compression standpoint. I was always wondering why it made it sound so good, just like Sound Goodizer does. Which, if you use FL Studio, you know what Sound Goodizer is. If you don't, it's just a knob that compresses your bus or your mixer output a ton and saturates it, so it always sounds good, which is why it's called Sound Goodizer. In any case, I'd always try to learn about compression, but I always failed every time because I just couldn't find a tutorial that helped. Until one day I decided, you know what, I'm gonna get into the root of the issue. Let me actually look up compression tutorials, because I think before I would just look up how to use compression, what a compressor does, maybe not what a compressor does, but how to use compression, how to compress, blah, blah, blah. One day I looked up, you know what, I need to learn everything about a compressor. I found a free video, a free course by mastering.com, I want to say it was. It was a 10-hour masterclass on how to use a compressor. And I watched the whole thing, not all in one sitting, but over the course of days and weeks and maybe just a month or so, I watched the entire thing, and only after that was I finally able to understand compression. And I think the biggest difference is in that tutorial, they actually explained what a compressor does and why to use a compressor. And they explained compressing with intention, right? Making sure you know when you reach for a compressor, know what you're trying to accomplish. And they gave you a list of the things that you can accomplish with a compressor. And with each of those things, they explained why it does what it does, how to do it, and all that stuff. So that really changed everything. And only then was I finally able to understand compressors. And man, did it make such a huge difference on everything, because it would have been easy just to throw a compressor, compress something and think, hey, it probably sounds better than before. But understanding why it does things and how to do things and when to do things made such a big difference. And that was the only compression tutorial I ever watched that actually helped, because most of the other ones tell you, hey, compression, it controls dynamics. If things are loud and quiet here, make the quiet parts louder and make the louder parts quieter, and then things are more balanced, everyone's happy. But I mean, there's so many things to compression that just weren't explained in any of those tutorials until I watched that 10-hour course. If you're a producer and you don't understand compression, if you reach a compression without intention, I would highly recommend that course. Some people don't like long courses. I almost exclusively like long courses because I feel like I'm getting everything and I'm not missing any piece of information. That one definitely changed my mixing skills forever, right? Everything after this is going to sound way better just objectively because things are going to be compressed and more controlled. And it's actually interesting. Last thing I'll say about this is I never really had an ear for the compression, but sometimes I would listen to my tracks and the way I visualized it is everything just felt like it was all over the place. I mean, in compression terms, we call it glue, but everything always just felt like it was all over the place. Like things just kind of weren't meshed, and the sound I was listening to was just kind of everywhere in my headphones. Sometimes I was up here, sometimes I was over here and down here and upside down and backwards. But once I started to get the hang of compression, I started to actually listen and I could visualize my waveform of my tracks just being more smooth and kind of staying right in the center where you want them to be, kind of right in the center of your ears and your head versus just all over the place. And that's when I started to get an ear for compression and start to be able to apply it, not just to this track, but to every track I made since then and to all my tracks moving forward. So big game changer. All right, moving on to the drop. We are 35 minutes into recording and I'm not even at the drop yet. I said this was going to be a short video, but first of all, that was never going to happen. I'm never going to make a short video. And B, again, it goes to show that even when there's no expression, there's always intention behind everything and there's cool things to know behind everything, even though it's not necessarily accurate to say that there's intention behind learning how to use a compressor in my track, yada, yada. There is intention between things like something as simple as having a ride on every other beat over here and splitting up these vocal samples and introducing the melody over here and sidechaining the bass. So there's intention on all sorts of things that I will never look over, that I'll always want to share and hopefully inspire people with. Anyways, where were we? We were over here because while listening to the drop, you get this drum fill to take you into the second part of the drop with a crash, which is where you get these passing tones over here. And I think I realized the issue is the clipping I'm hearing in my headphones is just a matter of FL Studio processing all these things. Hopefully it's not in the audio. That's beside the point. We get these passing tones. We actually get the lead, which you'll notice, well, actually we bring the vocal back in a second. But where I was going with this was this is kind of where the intention of why I made this track came into play. Because when I was listening to all these drum and bass tracks that had these melodies that were moving and had this groove to it, I wanted to make a track similar to that. So I didn't just want super saws like you hear over here, but after a while I wanted to introduce a lead that had some passing tones that were jumping all over the place. So I really like these leads. I really like these melodies that come with the track. And it really just makes a big difference to not only how the track sounds, how it grooves, but to what I wanted the track to sound like and what I imagined when I made this track. And look at that. Beautiful compressors all over the place. Lead bus has an OTT, but that's all right. Compression, beautiful. And let's take a listen to each one individually. We got passing tone number 1, out of Serum, Virtual Riot lead, really like that one. Passing tone number 2, out of Spire. Cool. And passing tone number 3, lead take 2. Yeah, just trying more things. Nice kind of a bright saw there for the lead. Solid. all together to a lead bus. This is hopefully, yeah, some reverb. Very little of it, but enough to hopefully give some width. Where you get the bass going, you got the sub, you got all this stuff. Leads start to come in. You also get this ride over here that I almost overlooked. That wasn't there before, although it layers with the ride that's already on here. Hi-hats on the drums. And now we got a drum and bass pattern. Actually got an open hi-hat over here as well. A little bit of panning as well that I should probably enable. That's the other thing. I started to experiment with more panning since I got more comfortable with drums and compressing them. And that's the other thing I noticed is that when you compress things, you start to realize how important it is to make sure everything fits, because even when things are compressed, you want to add more and more just to fill up that space that is missing because it's not compressed and the waveform's all over the place. So when you do compress things, you start to realize, hey, you know what? That actually sounds a little bit muddy, or something should probably be panned here, because things are a little bit more compact and it's more important to give everything its own space. So that also changed the game quite a bit. Anyways, back to the track. You got the passing tones, that lead over here. We're going to take away this mono supersaw in a second because the vocals are about to come back in. There we go. Ride every other beat over here. It's going to double in a second. But this is kind of the heart of the track. This is really the center of the track that I had in mind, that I imagined when I heard that vocal sample and wanted to build a track around it. If you saw my shorts, when I first started this track, I thought about making an idea of kind of sharing every step of the way along this track. I ditched that idea pretty quickly because sometimes I would just turn on my PC, just produce real quick for 30 minutes, get a ton done, and I didn't feel like recording it. And then that idea got scrapped pretty quickly. But if you followed me on social media, on TikTok, you would see that I shared the very first idea, the very first kind of layout I had for this track, where I called it starting a song from scratch, and it was this song. But again, I only got about 2 or 3 episodes in, and then I ditched it. But this is where the track originally started, right here. I heard the vocal sample. I wanted these passing tones for the groove. I wanted the super saws, and you actually also hear over here that we introduce a new synth that has a little bit more attack on the third beat. I still keep it over here on the first beat just for a little bit of extra noise and to take up some room. But it's really the third beat that introduces some attack and almost feels like it's hitting exclusively on that third beat. And then we take it down, and I really like this part. Inversions, sounds beautiful. But this is originally what I started with. It was the vocal sample in its full effect, where you get the full rhythm, da 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 da, on top of all the drums and the passing tones and that impact and the synths. This is the foundation of the track. It's the heart of the track too. And again, as I mentioned earlier, over here you have the ride on every other beat. Really listen for that ride right here. You hear it hitting every other beat, and it really plays well with the vocals. And then we double up on that ride right here to give it more movement leading into the second verse. Again, I really like this spot. And it's also worth mentioning that I mentioned you can't, I do need to interrupt myself for this because this is important. Speaking of the variation in rhythm and why this works so well, is because I mentioned you can't really alter vocal samples all that much, and it's true, you can't. One of the things I did, here's the thing about this vocal sample that I didn't like. One of the things I didn't like about this vocal sample, let's listen to it right here, is the very end of it where the rhythm kind of ends, it drops off quickly. Ba-ba, ba-da-ba, ba-da-ba-da. Right there. I didn't really like this part. In my brain, the first time I heard this vocal sample, I really liked it, and I already imagined where it was going to go. But I heard this part being dragged on, and my heart dragged on a little bit longer, and I didn't like how it just ended drastically. So I did a little bit of cutting, reverbing, affecting, and sending, and a bunch of other stuff over here, where on this first half of the drop right here, I actually just kind of dragged it out with some extra syllables. I took it from over here. Right here. That dragged on R over here, I took it and kind of stuck it onto the heart, the last word over here, the heart, to extend it a little bit longer. So it's not the cleanest, but with the right kind of layering, with the right levels and maybe a little bit of reverb, it's clean enough that it sounds like, let me mute this, it sounds like it's being dragged on. Again, you just kind of stitch those together and then it drags it on, which works really well over here where you eventually do just cut it off. So it goes from this, actually it goes from this to this. So it changes up the rhythm, which is why it pairs really nicely with this ride being doubled, where over here, every other beat picks it up a little bit. And again, that is the foundation of this track, where everything is there. The attack, the chords with the attack on the third, all these super saws, lead on the passing tones, play really well. Dun, dun, dun. Ride doubles up. Dun, dun, dun. Plays so well into the second half. Extend the super saws, bring the mono super saw back. Bass is still there, but we take away the sub, so it's the intro bass that's still there. And then we drop it all. So again, we talked about progression from tracks where the intro sounds something like this, to the second verse, where you get that ride, you keep the synths there in their full force. Over here we had this Chords Victory synth over here, we keep it, but we add a new one on top of it. We have the ride. The bass is there with the, I thought we left the sidechain on, but it looks like we didn't. Did we? We did. I knew I didn't make that mistake. Oh, here we are. I was looking at the wrong one. This is the one I was looking on. Over here, sidechain's not on. Here, sidechain is on. So again, we're changing up the rhythm. We're going from this drop, building it down a little bit where the drums are still extended. You got to appreciate those super saws. Into this over here, where we keep the ride. Now again, we keep the super saws, we keep the bass, we keep this ride over here, and I mentioned we added a new synth that I also really like. Second verse chords. It's almost bit crushed in a way. What is this? Has some nice attack to it, but again, it's very bit crushed. I really like this actually. What is this? Effects? Probably just some filters, comb filters, some noise. FM from B is probably what's doing that as well. But again, I really like that. Gets a nice unique feel to the track as well. Now at this point the vocals are gone, right? We don't really know what's going to happen from here. And as I mentioned, we can't really change the vocals, so it's not like we're adding another phrase. We're just allowing things to kind of take its place, just like reintroducing a mid bass right here with a full force side chain that really gets that rhythm, that plays with the ride, until we introduce the vocals again. Along with a really nice break that I like. I actually have never used a break like this in one of my tracks, and I just felt it fit perfectly in here. Also, on top of the rides and the snare, it wasn't as prominent as I liked it, so I believe I should have given it quite a bit of side boost. I did. Definitely gives it a lot more room. Very big difference. So anyways, kind of when the rhythm is up in the air again, after the drop, where we know exactly what the track sounds like, the ride stays there, we get that sidechain off the bass, we get even more pumping, but now the rhythm is up in the air. We don't really know where we're going to go from there. We don't even know if the sample's coming back, or if it does, how it comes back, but it does. With this new break we haven't heard, and the snare on the thirds, giving us every other beat actually. Just giving us some good rhythm here. Dragged out again, if you notice, into a buildup, which is unique because over here we didn't have the vocal on the buildup. So now we don't even know where the second drop is going to go, because if we went straight into, from the buildup that sounds like this, straight into this, that wouldn't be a very exciting track. Maybe it would actually, since I played that, back, but I don't think that'd be a very exciting track. So you kind of start to wonder where you're going to go. We get the same buildup over here, which is when I decide to make the decision to switch up the drop just entirely. Over here is where we're looking at now. All this bass, plus a lot of noises. Now, there's two reasons I decided to do this. Number one, again, this was around the time I was listening to a lot of drum and bass, and I really like that dance floor sound, so I wanted to include that dance floor sound, which I do over here. I tried including it earlier, but it couldn't quite get it to sound how I liked. But number two, as I mentioned, we can't really do much with this sample because we didn't create it. We don't have free freedom to change the words, add more words, change the lyrics, to change even the notes in a clean way. So you're very limited to what you can do with the track. This is where I think producers really need to start getting creative, because if you're using vocal samples that aren't your own, it can get really it'll get really easy to make your track stale and keep it uninteresting if you're using the same thing that you can't change. So why not just take that liberty and just make the second drop completely unique? Of course, I like this first drop. I love this first drop. But I just had the liberty of making it completely different, because at the end of the day, I'm not building the track around the vocals, I'm building it around kind of just the sounds and the groove. And I switched up the sounds and the groove completely because we're just building a track. We're not trying to do something to the vocals. The vocals aren't meaningful. The vocals don't carry some sort of expression to them, or really some intention to them. The intention over here was the rhythm, but the vocals themselves and the lyrics don't carry some intention and expression to them, which is why I didn't really care that we ditched them and just did something completely new for the second half of the drop, because we're not trying to build a track around the vocals. We're just trying to build a track. Now, that also reminds me, something I was supposed to mention earlier, was that why I named this track how I named it. If you'll notice, up to this point, all my track names are one-word names. Progress, call, low, express, release, all those things, exposition, all those things. But and there's a reason for that. I'm a fan of minimalistic track names. If a track's gonna have a name, which it does, all tracks have names. Where I was going with that is, if a track's gonna have a name, I think it should have a meaningful name. I don't think you should just name it whatever the hook is, whatever the most repeated phrases of a track. I think it should have something to it, some oomph to it. That's gonna make it stick around. Which is why I name my tracks things like progress, release, exposition. I mean, these big emotions. Even low, I mentioned, I think captures the track really well, because it's a simple, short word, just captures that feeling of low and just some bass. Call would have been an easy one. I could have just named it Call My Name. Could have named it Call My Name and call it a day. But again, the track isn't about the vocals. Call My Name doesn't have any meaning to it. It doesn't carry any weight to it. There's no expression behind it. So I didn't really know what to name the track, but Call just made so much sense. It has the recognizable word in it, so you remember what the track name is. It's Call. But it puts enough attention to the lyrics that you appreciate them, but not too much that you think they're meaningful. And then when you realize that they're not, and it's just a sample, it kind of ruins the track. And it gives it a super generic and boring name, like Call My Name. I think that would just be super generic and boring. And a lot of tracks nowadays just have tracks of the name where it's just the hook or the phrase. And that's all there is to it, which is an easy way to recognize it, but I feel like it doesn't really carry any weight. Versus something like Call, you can keep it with that one word name, keep it simplistic, keep it minimalistic, where it's recognizable, but it's not about the Call My Name. It's about everything else in the track, and that's why I named it Call. So, second drop. What do we do for the second drop? As I mentioned, we switch it up because it's not about the lyrics. But the other thing we do is we mess around with the two styles of drum and bass that I really like. There is this kind of very popular call and response style drum and bass where you get a bass sound responded by another bass sound. And then you kind of get this dance floor energy that we haven't gotten into yet that I really like by artists like Dimension and Subfocus. But this call and response style was something that I was very, very bad at. I still am pretty bad at. If you saw a release breakdown, you know that I'm not a big call and response artist / producer. But I wanted to experiment it with a little bit more, and I just kind of started throwing samples on here. If you saw the series I try to make about this track, you'll see the original kind of bass area I had, which was just samples thrown in there, and you just choose 10 and pick 5 that stick. And we get something that sounds like this. Well, first of all, let's look at the drums, because we get we ditch all these hi-hats for temporarily. We keep this loop right here, but we go from the build-up to the drop. Nice effects over here with that bass as a response, and this effect over here, this glitch that I've used in another track. I can't remember. I think it's Exposition. different response every time. We repeat the aggro bass over here. And again, about pattern names, this is one of the areas where you're just throwing everything and seeing what sticks. And when you're in the zone, and I just name things random stuff. Let's take a look, because we keep the sub. I really liked keeping the sub because it keeps the energy pumping a little bit. And actually, you'll notice, speaking of energy pumping, this brought to attention, I mentioned over here the sub has no sidechain on it. Sidechain to the kick. Has no kickstart on it, I should say. No pumping on it. But over here, that's when we start to turn the kickstart and the pumping up. So now there's actual pumping to it. And we play around with the pumping. So it's not just a 1/4 the entire time. We go from the 1/4 sidechain, the 1/4 kickstart, to the 1/2 kickstart, which I really like to do. Go ahead and listen to that right here. Change up the pumping. Then no pumping. Back to pumping. No sub. But that's because we got this this noise over here. This carries the sub with it. So it actually changes the rhythm of the sub as well. We go from 1/4 to 1/2 to nothing to 1/4 to this pattern. So the sub changes a lot in its rhythm, which I really like about this track. Other than that, we have these kind of call and response basses. This nice fill right here, plus the stab. Responded by this aggro bass. I'm trying to listen to what this is. Kind of forgot about this part. Oh, you can definitely hear that. Yeah, so that's also a response in that area. Responded by over here, we get this kind of call again. Same thing with the stab by the sub. I'm wondering why I didn't repeat the stab, but that's all right. Actually, it looks like we got some noise carrying into each one, which is probably why. Some fills over here. Again, call over here, new riser over here, new effect that I really like. And actually, on top of this rising kind of almost sweep, you actually pitch bend the sub, which if you listen to it, it adds some good variety to the track, but it's very subtle. It's very subtle because it's a sub. Right here. So again, a little bit of variety over here. Back into this call, into the aggro bass again, at which point we drop the drums, and it gives it a little bit of kind of a break, a little bit of variation, especially with this drum fill that I think does a really good job. Almost reversed. Into the dance floor part of the track. Bring that stab back, bring in some leads, and then we just enjoy the dance floor part itself. So again, because there's so many distinct parts of this track, it came down to a lot of mixer tracks, plus the effects. That's why it's 70 mixer tracks. But again, it's just switching up a little bit, especially with this really nice break, this really nice fill where the drums get dropped. The drums get dropped, everything gets dropped, but this aggro bass continues. Transitions really nicely into that dance floor part. And this was my first stab at a dance floor sound, a sound that I really like, that I want to work on more. I actually already have another track that I'm working on that has that dance floor sound. So maybe I did things right, maybe I did them wrong. But you have this, you have this nice loop I like, this nice sound I like out of Serum. Pretty cool. With a basic sub and another dance floor layer. Out of Spire, actually, or sorry, out of Serum, Trancy bass. Distorted quite a bit, if I remember correctly. Decapitator on here. Not too much, but enough. Yeah, I was gonna say definitely bringing up the side so that it takes up some space, with wider a little bit, with everything else, plus the stab. And actually some leads that speaking of if you saw a release breakdown, this lead sound, which one is it? This one? This one was actually on accident. So I was experimenting with a lead and came up with this melody. Let's listen to this one. This one's a little bit cleaner, just so you don't, because this one has a lot of kind of delay and it takes up a lot of width out of nowhere, like you hear right there. But this sound was actually on accident. I had the melody already, and I was just scrolling through my splice, kind of hitting these arrows and going side to side and listening for melodies. for sounds that I liked, and I couldn't find one I liked. I gave up on scrolling, went back to the track, probably tweaked a few things and listened to it. And I heard that lead and I thought, wait a minute, that sounds pretty good. And I just happened to have left it on this preset. And it worked out really well. And I think one of the reasons I didn't realize this at the time, but one of the reasons it worked out really well is because it gave the track some width. Without this track would have kind of no width and it would be pretty dull. I mean, even if we just kind of muted the delay and all and the kind of the reverb, there's not a lot of width to it and it sounds pretty boring. So when I heard this and I realized that, hey, why does it sound so good? And I realized, oh, you know what? It's giving a lot of width that the track actually didn't have. That's when I added this other preset. That definitely gives it more width, brings it to life a little bit more, and really fills in everything. And then you get this really nice dance floor section. Again, it's not the cleanest because it's my first take at that dance floor sound. But I like it. I think it does a good job. I think it switches it up quite a bit. And with these hi-hats that I worked with, nice space to the sides, plus the drums, you get a half decent dance floor area at least. Plus with this effect that we had earlier, and a stab again, plus with this effect we had earlier. And then we just let the dance floor hit the entire time. With a riser over here to finish out the track. And you actually end the track on kind of the two things that split up this track. You end it with the impact of the chords victory, and you end it with the aggressive bass we had in the second half. By the way, this is a sample that I just dragged into over, I think it's right here, over here. Same thing. But again, you end with the nice chords that give you that feel and that emotion to some extent, and the aggressive bass that sums up the second half of the drum. So there's that dance floor energy, risers coming up as you're listening to it, and we end with that impact with this downlift. That would be the ending. All right, an hour and 1 minute into recording. I know I said this video was going to be a short one, but you know what? That's just sometimes the way it goes. Again, intention is the name of the game. Not as much expression with this track, but intention is always the name of the game. So of course, there were going to be a lot of things I wanted to break down and mention and not overlook. The biggest ones I already touched on. The other big one I didn't touch on is just going to be that compression, because I tend to not go into the mixing just because I forget. I'm more interested in the patterning and the decisions I make when I'm laying out all these things that you see right here. So I just kind of overlook and forget about the mixing. So I'm not going to go into it, but real quick, I mean, just looking at all these drums that have no compression on it, but the drum bus does, that changes things drastically. And then just multiplied by whatever does need compression, some hi-hats over here that look like they need a compression. Yeah, not a lot going on here because these are some pretty high quality samples, but there's a lot of compression, especially kind of on these bass effects. I mean, look at this. Compressor. Dialing in that bass was a big thing with this track. Now that I learned how to use compressors, 2 in series, a third compressor, although one or two of these might just be sidechain. Dance floor with compression over here, compressor over here. It made such a big difference. Vocals had some compression, all that stuff, and the leads, were compressed. So it makes a big difference. So to finish it up, one of the things I was supposed to mention, or that I kind of want to solo over here, is just the difference between the drums with the drum bus compression versus without the drum bus compression, because it really does make a difference. So let's take a listen. This is the drop drums over here. Let's listen to the part with the most drums. Let's go right here. So let's turn the compressor off. Let's listen to what it sounds like. I mean, it's just, my ears are already so trained for the compression that it sounds exactly as I described it earlier, where before the compression, the waveform's kind of all over the place. It just sounds like, if I were to close my eyes, it just sounds like the waveform is spread out evenly up here, down here, and it's just a mess. Versus with compression, just sounds like it stays kind of tight towards the center the entire time. It literally compresses it, and it just feels like it sounds like it tightens it up a little bit. And again, in compression, we call it glue. It glues everything together. Instead of having just sounds everywhere, the compressor glues everything and just makes it feel like it's one cohesive piece. So let's listen to this real quick without compression and then with compression. We're actually going to have this so we can get that crash. By the way, offbeat crash, instead of having that crash at the beginning where I forgot to mention this. I'm starting to experiment with crashes more. Instead of having that crash on the beginning of the beat, of the phrase, I should say, it's offset by one beat, which I really like. Where were we? Right here. Let's listen to this part again without compression and then with compression. And that's on me. Compressor off. And then again, 2 loops and I'll turn it on without saying anything. Big difference. It just sounds more compressed. That's the word I start using now because I can hear the compression. It sounds more compressed. Although my brain, I want to say tighter and just more controlled. Just tighter is the word I want to use. But enough about that, right? So again, all these compressors that I started to use to control everything. And that's the other thing. Now that I understand compression, I started to get more comfortable using things like Camel Crusher because I started to realize when they should be applied, when it's appropriate to apply them and to really squash your sound in context, but to squash your sound and knowing what it does instead of just throwing it on there and thinking, hey, it sounds thicker, it sounds better, I'm going to leave it that way, but not knowing if what you're doing is ultimately destroying your track. So big difference. Definitely recommend that compression course. But now that's it. Again, now we're 1:06 into recording this video, so I got carried away for another 4 or 5 minutes. So that's just a testament to what it's like watching my videos. Everything's going to be long always. Again, thank you so much for watching, everyone. If you made it all the way to the end, I hope you enjoyed the track. It's out on all platforms. If you like drum and bass, if you like the track, let me know what you think. If you have any feedback, if you have some things that you would do differently, if you have some things that you liked, that you disliked, if you learned anything, if you have any questions or comments about the track. But other than that, that is it. Thank you guys so much for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe, comment, share, and I will see you guys next time.